7,000 years ago, in a river gorge on the border of modern Serbia and Romania, two completely different populations of ancient humans lived side by side, ate together, likely traded with each other, and buried their dead in the same cemeteries for something like 4 centuries straight. And for over a decade, the leading genetic model of European prehistory said this shouldn't have been possible at all. It said the incoming farmers simply replaced the hunter-gatherers who came before them, wave after wave, region after region, almost like flipping a switch, one population erased and another installed in its place within a few short generations. New ancient DNA research has just torn a hole directly through that clean, confident story, and the real picture turns out to involve centuries of coexistence, stubborn holdout populations surviving far longer than anyone expected, and genetic blending that looks nothing like a simple, uniform takeover. Stick with me for the next few minutes, and you'll understand exactly what the old model got wrong, and why the actual evidence is honestly more interesting than the myth it replaced. If that sounds like your kind of rabbit hole, go ahead and subscribe now, because we're diving straight in. For most of the past 15 years, one story dominated how scientists explained the single biggest demographic shift in European prehistory, the arrival of farming. Starting around 8,500 years ago, groups carrying agricultural knowledge, domesticated crops and livestock began moving out of Anatolia and the Aegean basin, pushing steadily into the heart of Europe. Along 2 main corridors, one hugging the Mediterranean coastline and island hopping through the Western Sea, the other cutting through the Danube River Valley into the continental interior. Waiting for them across this landscape were Mesolithic hunter-gatherer populations who had already been living there for thousands of years, hunting, fishing, and gathering wild foods across forests, coastlines, and river systems that predated agriculture by a very long time, having developed their own deep, sophisticated, hard-won knowledge of these specific landscapes across countless preceding generations. Landmark ancient DNA studies published through the 2010s, drawing on skeletal remains recovered across Germany, Spain, Hungary, and beyond, converged on a strikingly consistent conclusion that seemed, at the time, remarkably solid. Wherever farming arrived, the genetic signature of the local population shifted dramatically and quickly, with incoming farmer ancestry rapidly becoming dominant, and Mesolithic hunter-gatherer ancestry dropping to a small fraction of the total, sometimes just a few percent, within a handful of generations. Researchers working with early Neolithic skeletons from sites like the Linearbandkeramik culture in Central Europe repeatedly found genomes looking almost entirely Anatolian in origin, with barely a detectable trace of the hunter-gatherer populations known to have already been living in those same river valleys for thousands of years beforehand, hunting the same forests and fishing the same waterways. This became known broadly as the demic diffusion model, and it painted a picture of near total population turnover happening again and again as the farming frontier pushed steadily westward and northward across the continent, from the Balkans through Central Europe, and eventually reaching Britain, Scandinavia, and the Iberian Peninsula on the far western edge of the continent. According to one especially influential way of framing this pattern, farmer lineages appeared to gradually thin out the further you traveled from the Near East. Exactly what you'd expect from repeated waves of migrating agricultural populations with only very limited local absorption of hunter-gatherers at each step along the way, almost like a genetic signal steadily diluting itself with distance and time. This wasn't a fringe idea confined to a handful of specialist journals. It became close to textbook consensus, repeated across popular science writing, museum exhibits, and documentary narration for the better part of a decade, cited as one of the clearest, best supported success stories of the entire ancient DNA revolution then still unfolding. The story was clean, it was dramatic, and crucially, it fit the genomic data that was actually available at the time reasonably well, since most of the earliest, highest profile ancient genomes sequenced happened to come from exactly the regions where replacement really had been dramatic and fast. If discovering that one of the most confidently repeated stories in modern archaeogenetics just got quietly dismantled by better, more geographically detailed evidence, sounds like the kind of correction worth knowing about before your next casual conversation about ancient history, that's exactly why it helps to subscribe right now. Because the study that changed this took an entirely different approach to testing it than anything that came before. Published in August of 2025 in the journal Science Advances, a research team led by geneticist Alexandros Tsoupas and evolutionary biologist Matthias Kuret at the University of Geneva, working alongside colleagues at the Swiss Institute of Bioinformatics and Johannes Gutenberg University in Mainz, took a fundamentally different approach to testing the old replacement model. Rather than simply comparing ancient genomes to modern populations the way earlier studies largely had, or relying on models that treated the entire continent as a single uniform process, the team built a spatially explicit computer simulation, one capable of jointly modeling demography, migration, and biological interaction between two populations across an actual geographic landscape rather than an abstract statistical average. They focused specifically on the continental route into Europe along the Danube corridor and tested that simulation directly against high-quality paleogenomic data recovered from 67 prehistoric individuals excavated along this exact migration path. Their model tracked demography, migration, and biological interaction between hunter-gatherers and farmers simultaneously across both time and physical space, allowing the researchers to ask a much more precise question than earlier studies ever could. Not simply how much admixture happened on average across the whole continent, but exactly how that admixture varied from one specific location to the next, and how it changed as decades and centuries passed at each individual site along the frontier. What they found broke cleanly with the old uniform replacement story that had dominated the field for so long. Admixture between hunter-gatherers and farmers wasn't a fixed one-time event baked into the earliest stage of contact and then locked in place forever afterward. It increased steadily over time at each individual location, and its intensity varied considerably from place to place, ranging from essentially no detectable gene flow at all when farming communities first arrived in a given local area, up to somewhere between 5 and 10% hunter-gatherer input, showing up in later phases of that same regional sequence, sometimes generations or even centuries after the farmers had first arrived. The team also estimated that the effective population size of incoming farming communities ran roughly 5 times larger than that of the hunter-gatherer groups already living in the same landscape long before them, which helps explain why farmer ancestry dominated the overall genetic signal so heavily in many places, simply through sheer weight of numbers rather than anything resembling deliberate total displacement. But a heavily outnumbered population isn't the same thing as a fully erased one, and the local, gradually increasing admixture this new model revealed simply doesn't fit inside the old story of clean, near-instant, wholesale population replacement repeating uniformly everywhere the farming frontier advanced across the continent. If the idea that this entire transition looked less like a single decisive wave and more like a slow, geographically uneven negotiation between two coexisting populations sounds like the kind of nuanced textbooks conveniently left out for the sake of a cleaner narrative, that's exactly why it helps to subscribe. Because the regional case studies underneath this bigger picture get even more specific and, honestly, a good deal stranger. Take the Baltic region, stretching across parts of modern Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Genomic evidence recovered from this part of northeastern Europe shows something that doesn't fit the replacement narrative at all. Local hunter-gatherer populations there appear to have adopted farming as a practice, a lifestyle, and eventually an entire economic system, without any meaningful genetic input from outside farming populations arriving to replace them. In other words, agriculture spread into this specific region as an idea and a set of skills passed between neighboring communities, perhaps through trade contacts, intermarriage at the margins, or simple cultural observation and imitation, not as a wave of new people physically taking over the landscape and displacing whoever had been living there before. The population genetically stayed essentially the same, generation after generation. Only what those people actually did for a living and how they fed themselves changed. It's a striking mirror image of what happened in some other parts of the continent, where the genes moved and the culture came along with them. In the Baltic case, the culture moved on its own, largely without the genes ever needing to follow. If discovering that agriculture could spread across an entire region purely as a set of borrowed ideas and imitated techniques, with the underlying population never actually changing at all, reshapes how you think about cultural change more broadly, and how quickly we tend to assume new customs must mean new people. Go ahead and subscribe, because the next regional case study is arguably even stranger still. Then there's the Iron Gates region, the dramatic river gorge carved by the Danube along the modern border between Serbia and Romania, the exact case this video opened with at the very start. Archaeological and genetic evidence from this specific location shows hunter-gatherers and early farmers living directly alongside one another for centuries, exhibiting only minimal genetic admixture, despite that extended, sustained contact spanning roughly 400 years by some estimates. These weren't two populations that briefly crossed paths before one quickly absorbed the other the way the old model would confidently predict should happen. They were neighbors for something like 15 or 16 generations in a row, sharing fishing grounds along the Danube, likely trading goods, and in some cases even burying their dead in overlapping cemetery sites, all while choosing, for whatever combination of cultural, social, or purely practical reasons archaeology still can't fully explain, to remain largely genetically distinct from each other even while sharing the same valley floor and almost certainly the same trade networks and seasonal rhythms of river life. A separate genomic time transect study focused on north-central Poland, a region sitting along the northern frontier of where Neolithic farming culture initially reached before slowing down considerably in the face of denser forests and a harsher climate, adds yet another layer to this picture, and in some ways it's the most dramatic evidence of all against the old clean replacement narrative. Researchers analyzing 17 individuals spanning roughly 2,400 years, from the Middle Neolithic through the Early Bronze Age, between approximately 4,300 and 1900 BCE, found recurrent hunter-farmer admixture happening repeatedly across 3 full millennia, rather than as a single clean pulse of mixing that settled quickly into a stable new equilibrium, the way the old model implied should happen everywhere. Even more strikingly, the same research documented unadmixed hunter-gatherer populations still surviving as late as 4300 BCE in this region, holding on to a genetically distinct identity for well over 1,000 years after farming communities had already become established nearby, and, in some interpretations of the older model, should have already fully absorbed or displaced them. This wasn't a brief transitional overlap measured in a generation or two, a temporary rough patch on the way to a foregone conclusion. It was a genuinely prolonged coexistence stretching across dozens of generations, involving repeated pulses of contact and mixing, rather than one tidy merger before the two populations eventually blended together, along with a separate later wave of step-associated migration that arrived toward the end of this same long sequence and added yet another genetic layer on top of everything that came before it. If picturing entire communities of hunter-gatherers holding out for well over 1,000 years alongside their farming neighbors, generation after generation, quietly maintaining their own genetic identity long after the textbook said they should have, disappeared. Reframes how you think about this whole transition? Go ahead and subscribe, because there's one more twist in this story, and it involves which specific genes actually survived the blending process once it finally happened, centuries or even millennia later. A 2023 study published in the journal Current Biology, led by geneticist Tom Davey alongside senior authors Ian Matheson and Pontus Skoglund at the Francis Crick Institute in London, examined genome-wide data from 677 individuals spanning the Mesolithic and Neolithic periods across Europe, hunting for evidence of natural selection acting specifically on the admixed segments of DNA left behind once hunter-gatherer and farmer ancestry had mixed together inside the same individuals. This kind of analysis is genuinely difficult to pull off well, since it requires identifying not just which ancestry a given stretch of genome came from, but whether that particular ancestry shows up more or less often than pure chance alone would predict at that specific location in the genome, a signature that only makes sense once you've properly reconstructed which parent population contributed which chunk of DNA in the first place. What they found adds a genuinely fascinating wrinkle to the whole story. Around the pigmentation-associated gene SLC24A5, which plays a major role in determining lighter skin tone, Neolithic farmer ancestry was dramatically overrepresented, the strongest such signal found anywhere in the entire genome, suggesting that specific farmer-derived genetic variants linked to skin pigmentation were actively favored and spread more successfully once the two populations combined, likely reflecting some genuine adaptive advantage in the specific environments and diets these populations were now sharing. But in the exact opposite direction, across the major histocompatibility complex, a critical region of the genome governing immune system function, and the body's ability to recognize and fight off pathogens, hunter-gatherer ancestry showed up dramatically overrepresented. Instead, a pattern strong enough to suggest genuine natural selection had specifically favored retaining Mesolithic immune system genetics, even as farmer ancestry swept through most of the rest of the genome elsewhere, possibly because those older hunter-gatherer immune variants offered better protection against pathogens the local population had already been exposed to for thousands of years. That detail matters enormously for how we should picture this whole process happening on the ground, generation after generation. This wasn't simply one population fading out while another quietly took its place wholesale, a passive genetic dilution running on autopilot. It was an active, selective, genuinely two-way biological exchange, where specific hunter-gatherer genetic contributions were retained and actively favored by natural selection in exactly the parts of the genome where they apparently offered some kind of real, measurable advantage, immune defense chief among them, even as they were displaced almost everywhere else in the genome by the sheer numerical weight of incoming farming populations and their much larger effective population size. If the idea that immune system genes and pigmentation genes were essentially fighting two completely different evolutionary battles inside the same admixed population at the exact same time in the exact same bodies sounds like the kind of biological nuance the old simple story completely flattened, go ahead and subscribe, because pulling all of these threads together changes the whole picture considerably. Put all of these pieces together, and the old, tidy story of a farming wave simply erasing hunter-gatherer populations across Europe starts looking less like settled fact and more like an oversimplified average drawn across wildly different local outcomes, each shaped by its own particular mix of geography, population density, and social relationships between farmers and foragers already living there. In some places, genuine large-scale genetic replacement really did happen, and happened fast. Exactly the pattern the earlier studies first identified, and that pattern remains real and well documented across large stretches of Central and Western Europe, where farmer ancestry genuinely does dominate the genetic record almost completely. But in the Baltics, hunter-gatherers kept their own genetic identity, while simply picking up a new way of making a living from their neighbors. In the Iron Gates, two populations shared a landscape for roughly 4 centuries without meaningfully blending at all, despite what was almost certainly regular daily contact. In Poland, unmixed hunter-gatherer communities held on for over 1,000. Years passed when they were supposedly already gone according to the old model, with admixture happening in fits and starts across 3 millennia, rather than settling quickly into a stable new population. And even within regions where farmer ancestry did come to dominate the overall genetic picture, hunter-gatherer genetics didn't simply vanish without a trace. Specific pieces of it were retained, actively selected for, and carried forward specifically because they conferred a genuine biological advantage that outlasted the demographic imbalance between the two populations. Perhaps the most important lesson embedded in this entire body of research has less to do with any single ancient population, and more to do with how easily a genuinely useful early model, built on the best available data at the time, can calcify into an oversimplified universal law the moment it gets repeated often enough in popular retellings, documentaries, and classroom summaries. The demic diffusion model wasn't wrong because the underlying ancient DNA evidence behind it was bad or poorly analyzed. It was incomplete, built primarily from regions where replacement genuinely was the dominant, fastest-moving pattern, then generalized outward as though it must have applied everywhere else too, uniformly across an entire continent with wildly different local ecologies, population densities, river systems, and cultural relationships already existing between farmers and foragers long before either group ever fully understood the other. A model built from a handful of well-sampled sites in Germany and Hungary simply couldn't have predicted what was quietly happening in a Polish river valley or Baltic forest at the exact same moment in history. And for over a decade, almost nobody had the geographic breadth of sampling needed to notice the difference. And that leaves us with a genuinely striking image to close on. Picture that river gorge on the Serbian-Romanian border again. 2 different peoples, 2 different ways of getting food, sharing the same valley floor for something like 16 generations, close enough to intermarry, close enough to trade, bury their dead nearby, and share the same fish-filled stretch of river every single season, and yet, according to the genetic evidence, largely choosing not to blend their bloodlines very often at all, for reasons that likely made perfect social sense to the people living it, even if they're nearly invisible to us today. Multiply that kind of quiet, complicated, centuries-long negotiation across dozens of different landscapes throughout Europe, each with its own local balance of population size, geography, and social relationships between neighbors who ate differently and worked the land differently, and you get something far messier and far more genuinely human than any single sentence about one population simply replacing another could ever properly capture. The Neolithic transition wasn't one story repeated identically everywhere it touched. It was hundreds of overlapping local stories, unfolding on their own separate timelines. And geneticists are only now, with better tools and far wider sampling than a decade ago, finally getting detailed enough evidence to read more than one of them at a time.